JUDE the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. Preface, 1895, and Revised Preface and Postscript of 1912. Preface, 1895. The history of this novel, whose birth in its present shape has been much retarded by the necessities of periodical publication, is briefly as follows. The scheme was jotted down in 1890 from notes made in 1887 and onwards, some of the circumstances being suggested by the death of a woman in the former year. The scenes were revisited in October 1892. The narrative was written in outline in 1892 and the spring of 1893, and at full length, as it now appears from August 1893 onwards into the next year, the whole, with the exception of a few chapters, being in the hands of the publisher by the end of 1894. It was begun as a serial story in Harper's Magazine at the end of November 1894, and was continued in monthly parts. But as in the case of Tay of the D'Umbervilles, the magazine version was, for various reasons, abridged and modified in some degree, the present edition being the first in which the whole appears as originally written. And in the difficulty of coming to an early decision in the matter of a title, the tale was issued under a provisional name, two such titles having in fact been successfully adopted. The present and final title, deemed on the whole the best, was one of the earliest thought of. For a novel addressed by a man to men and women of full age, which attempts to deal unaffectedly with the fret and fever, derision and disaster that may press in the wake of the strongest passion known to humanity, and to point without a mincing of words the tragedy of unfulfilled aims, I am not aware that there is anything in the handling to which exception can be taken. Like former productions of this pen, Jude the Obscure is simply an endeavor to give shape and coherence to a series of seemings or personal impressions. The question of their consistency or their discordance, of their permanence or their transitoriness, being regarded as not of the first moment. August 1895, Thomas Hardy. Okay, preface to the first edition. As silently revised in 1912. Here goes. The history of a novel whose birth in its present shape has been much retarded by the necessities of periodical publication is briefly as follows. The scheme was jotted down in 1890 from notes made in 1887 and onwards, some of the circumstances being suggested by the death of a woman in the former year. The scenes were revisited in October 1892. The narrative was written in outline in 1892 and the spring of 1893, and at full length, as it now appears from August 1893 onwards into the next year, the whole, with the exception of a few chapters, being in the hands of the publisher by the end of 1894. It was begun as a serial story in Harper's Magazine at the end of November 1894, and was continued in monthly parts. But as in the case of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, the magazine version was for various reasons an abridged and modified one, the present edition being the first in which the whole appears as originally written, and in the difficulty of coming to an early decision in the matter of a title, the tale was issued under a provisional name. Two such titles having in fact been successfully adopted. The present and final title, deemed on the whole the best, was one of the earliest thought of. For a novel addressed by a man to men and women in full age, which attempts to deal unaffectedly with the fret and fever, derision, and disaster that may press in the wake of the strongest passion known to humanity, to tell, without a mincing of words, of a deadly war waged between flesh and spirit, and to point the tragedy of unfulfilled aims. I am not aware that there is anything in the handling to which exception can be taken. Like former productions of this pen, Jude the Obscure is simply an endeavor to give shape and coherence to a series of seemings or personal impressions, the question of their consistency or their discordance, of their permanence or their transitoriness, being regarded as not of the first moment. August 1895, and that is transitoriness. Right. Following, postscript. The issue of this book 16 years ago, with the explanatory preface given above, was followed by unexpected incidents, and one can now look back for a moment at what happened. Within a day or two of its publication, the reviewers pronounced upon it in tones to which the reception of Tess of the d'Urbervilles bore no comparison, though there were 2 or 3 dissentients from the chorus. This solution of the story in England was instantly cabled to America, and the music was reinforced on that side of the Atlantic in a shrill crescendo. In my own eyes, the sad feature of the attack was that the greater part of the story, that which presented the shattered ideas of the 2 chief characters, and had been more especially, indeed, almost exclusively, the part of interest to myself, was practically ignored by the adverse press of the 2 countries, the while that some 20 or 30 pages of sorry detail deemed necessary to complete the narrative and show the antitheses in Jude's life were almost the sole portions read and regarded. And curiously enough, a reprint the next year of a fantastic tale that had been published in a family paper some time before drew down upon my head a continuation of the same sort of invective from several quarters. So much for the unhappy beginning of Jude's career as a book. After these verdicts from the press, its next misfortune was to be burnt by a bishop, probably in his despair at not being able to burn me. Then somebody discovered that Jude was a moral work, austere in its treatment of a difficult subject, as if the writer had not all the time said that it was in the preface. Thereupon many uncursed me, and the matter ended. The only effort of it on human conduct that I could discover being its effect on myself. The experience completely curing me of further interest in novel writing. One incident among many arising from the storm of words was that an American man of letters, who did not whitewash his own morals, informed me that, having bought a copy of the book on the strength of the shocked criticisms, he read on, wondering when the harmfulness was going to begin, and at last flung it across the room with execrations at having been induced by the rascally reviewers to waste $1.50 on what he was pleased to call a religious and ethical treatise. I sympathized with him, and assured him honestly that the misrepresentations had been no collusive trick of mine to increase my circulation among the subscribers to the papers in question. Then there was the case of the lady who, having shuddered at the book in an influential article bearing intermediate headlines of horror and printed in a world-read journal, wrote to me shortly afterwards that it was her desire to make my acquaintance. To return, however, to the book itself, the marriage laws being used in great part as the tragic machinery of the tale, and its general drift on the domestic side tending to show that, in Diderot's words, the civil law should be only the enunciation of the law of nature, a statement that requires some qualification, by the way. I have been charged since 1895 with a large responsibility in this country for the present shop-soiled condition of the marriage theme, as a learned writer characterized it the other day. I do not know. My opinion at that time, if I remember rightly, was what it is now, that a marriage should be dissolvable as soon as it becomes a cruelty to either of the parties, being then essentially and morally no marriage. And it seemed a good foundation for the fable of a tragedy, told for its own sake as a presentation of particulars containing a good deal that was universal, and not without a hope that certain cathartic Aristotelian qualities might be found therein. The difficulties down to 20 or 30 years back of acquiring knowledge in letters without pecuniary means were used in the same way, though I was informed that some readers thought these episodes an attack on venerable institutions, and that when Ruskin College was subsequently founded, it should have been called the College of Jude the Obscure. Artistic effort always pays heavily for finding its tragedies in the forced adaptation of human instincts to rusty and irksome molds that do not fit them. To do Bludyer and the conflagratory Bishop justice, what they meant seems to have been only this: we Britons hate ideas, and we are going to live up to that privilege of our native country. Your picture may not show the untrue or the uncommon, or even be contrary to the canons of art, but it is not the view of life that we who thrive on conventions can permit to be painted. But what did it matter? As for the matrimonial scenes, in spite of their touching the spot, and the screaming of a poor lady in Blackwood that there was an unholy anti-marriage league afoot, the famous sacrament, is doing fairly well still, and people marry and give in what may or may not be true marriage as light-heartedly as ever. The author has even been reproached by some earnest correspondents that he has left the question where he found it, and has not pointed the way to a much-needed reform. After the issue of Jude the Obscure as a serial story in Germany, an experienced reviewer of that country informed the writer that Sue Bridehead, the heroine, was the first delineation in fiction of the woman who was coming into notice in her thousands every year, the woman of the feminist movement, the slight, pale bachelor girl, the intellectualized, emancipated bundle of nerves that modern conditions were producing, mainly in cities, as yet, who does not recognize the necessity for most of her sex to follow marriage as a profession, and boast themselves as superior people because they are licensed to be loved on the premises. The regret of this critic was that the portrait of the newcomer had been left to be drawn by a man, and was not by one of her own sex, who would never have allowed her to break down at the end. Whether this assurance is borne out by dates I cannot say, nor am I able, across the gap of years since the production of the novel, to exercise more criticism upon it of a general kind than extends to a few verbal corrections, whatever good or bad it may contain. And no doubt there can be more in a book than the author consciously puts there, which will help either to its profit or to its disadvantage, as the case may be. April 1912. Thomas Hardy. End of preface and postscript. Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. The letter killeth. Part first. At Mary Green. Yea, many there be that have run out of their wits for women, and became servants for their sakes. Many also have perished, have erred, and sinned for women. O ye men, how can it be but women should be strong, seeing they do thus? Esdras. 1. At Mary Green. The schoolmaster was leaving the village, and everybody seemed sorry. The miller at Crescombe lent him the small white tilted cart and horse to carry his goods to the city of his destination, about 20 miles off, such a vehicle proving of quite sufficient size for the departing teacher's efforts. For the schoolhouse had been partly furnished by the managers, and the only cumbersome article possessed by the master, in addition to the packing case of books, was a cottage piano that he had bought at an auction during the year in which he thought of learning instrumental music. But the enthusiasm having waned, he had never acquired any skill in playing, and the purchased article had been a perpetual trouble to him ever since in moving house. The rector had gone away for the day, being a man who disliked the sight of changes. He did not mean to return till the evening, when the new school-teacher would have arrived and settled in, and everything would be smooth again. The blacksmith, the farm bailiff, and the schoolmaster himself were standing in perplexed attitudes in the parlor before the instrument. The master had remarked that even if he got into the cart, he should not know what to do with it on his arrival at Christminster, the city he was bound for, since he was only going into temporary lodgings just at first. A little boy of 11, who had been thoughtfully assisting in the packing, joined the group of men, and as they rubbed their chins, he spoke up, blushing at the sound of his own voice. "Aunt have got a great fuel-house, and it could be put there, perhaps, till you found a place to settle in, sir." "A proper good notion," said the blacksmith. It was decided that a deputation should wait on the boy's aunt, an old maiden resident, and ask her if she would house the piano till Mr. Phillotson should send for it. The smith and the bailiff started to see the practicability of the suggested shelter, and the boy and the schoolmaster were left standing alone. sorry I am going, Jude?" asked the latter kindly. Tears rose into the boy's eyes, for he was not among the regular day scholars who came unromantically close to the schoolmaster's life, but one who had attended the night school only during the present teacher's term of office. The regular scholars, if the truth must be told, stood at the present moment afar off, like certain historic disciples, indisposed to any enthusiastic volunteering of aid. The boy awkwardly opened the book he held in his hand, which Mr. Tillotson had bestowed on him as a parting gift, and admitted that he was sorry. "So am I," said Mr. Tillotson. "Why do you go, sir?" asked the boy. "Ah, that would be a long story. You wouldn't understand my reasons, Jude. You will, perhaps, when you're older." "I think I should now, sir." "Well, don't speak of this everywhere. You know what a university is, and a university degree? It is the necessary hallmark of a man who wants to do anything in teaching. My scheme, or dream, is to be a university graduate, and then to be ordained. By going to live at Christminster, or near it, I shall be at headquarters, so to speak, and if my scheme is practicable at all, I consider that being on the spot will afford me a better chance of carrying it out than I should have elsewhere." The smith and his companion returned. Old Miss Folly's fuel-house was dry and eminently practicable, and she seemed willing to give the instrument standing room there. It was accordingly left in the school till the evening, when more hands would be available for removing it, and the schoolmaster gave a final glance round. The boy Jude assisted in loading some small articles, and at 9 o'clock Mr. Tillotson mounted beside his box of books and other impedimenta, and bade his friends good-bye. "I shan't forget you, Jude," he said, smiling, as the cart moved off. "Be a good boy. Remember and be kind to animals and birds, and read all you can. And if ever you come to Christminster, remember you hunt me out for old acquaintance' sake." The cart creaked across the green, and disappeared round the corner by the rectory house. The boy returned to the draw-well at the edge of the greensward, where he had left his buckets when he went to help his patron and teacher in the loading. There was a quiver in his lips now, and after opening the well cover to begin lowering the bucket, he paused and leant with his forehead and arms against the framework, his face wearing the fixity of a thoughtful child who has felt the pricks of life somewhat before his time. The well into which he was looking was as ancient as the village itself, and from his present position appeared as a long circular perspective, ending in a shining disk of quivering water at a distance of 100 feet. There was a lining of green moss near the top, and nearer still the hart's-tongue fern. He said to himself, in the melodramatic tones of a whimsical boy, that the schoolmaster had drawn at that well scores of times on the morning like this, and would never draw there any more. I've seen him look down into it when he was tired with his drawing, just as I do now, and when he rested a bit before carrying the buckets home. But he was too clever to bide here any longer, a small, sleepy place like this. A tear rolled from his eye into the depths of the well. The morning was a little foggy, and the boy's breathing unfurled itself as a thicker fog upon the still and heavy air. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden outcry. "Bring on that water, will you idle young harlequin!" It came from an old woman who had emerged from her door, towards the garden gate of a green thatched cottage not far off. The boy quickly waved a signal of assent, drew the water with what was a great effort for one of his stature, landed and emptied the big bucket into his own pair of smaller ones, and, pausing a moment for breath, stared with them across the patch of clammy greensward wherein the well stood, nearly in the center of the little village, or rather hamlet. It was as old-fashioned as it was small, and it rested in the lap of an undulating upland adjoining the North Wessex Downs. Old as it was, however, the well shaft was probably the only relic of the local history that remained absolutely unchanged. Many of the thatched and dormered dwelling-houses had been pulled down of late years, and many trees felled on the green. Above all, the original church, hump-backed, wood-turreted, and quaintly hipped, had been taken down and either cracked up into heaps of road metal in the lane, or utilized as pigsty walls, garden seats, guard stones to fences, and rockeries in the flower beds of the neighborhood. In spite of it, a tall new building of German Gothic design, unfamiliar to English eyes, had been erected on a new piece of ground by a certain obliterator of historic records, who had run down from London and back in a day. The site whereon so long had stood the ancient temple to the Christian divinities was not even recorded on the green and level grass plot that had immemorially been the churchyard, the obliterated graves being commemorated by 9-penny cast-iron crosses warranted to last 5 years. Chapter 1, Part 2. Slender as was Jude Fawley's frame, he bore the 2 brimming house buckets of water to the cottage without resting. Over the door was a little rectangular piece of blue board, on which was painted in yellow letters, "Drusilla Fawley Baker." Within the little lead panes of the window, this being one of the few old houses left, were 5 bottles of sweets and 3 buns on a plate of the willow pattern. While emptying the buckets at the back of the house, he could hear an animated conversation in progress within doors between his great-aunt and Drusilla of the signboard and some other villagers. Having seen the schoolmaster depart, they were summing up particulars of the event and indulging in predictions of his future. "And who's he?" asked one, comparatively a stranger, when the boy entered. "Well, you med ask it, Mrs. Williams." "He's my great-nephew. Come since you was last this May." The old inhabitant who answered was a tall, gaunt woman, who spoke tragically on the most trivial subject, and gave a phrase of her conversation to each auditor in turn. "He come from Mellstock, down in South Wessex, about a year ago, worse luck for, in Belinda," turning to the right, "where his father was living, and was took with the shakings for death, and died in 2 days, as you know, Caroline," turning to the left. "It would ha' been a blessing if God A'mighty had took thee too, with a mother and father, poor useless boy. But I've got him here to stay with me, till I can see what's to be done with un, though I be obliged to let him earn any penny he can. Just now he's scaring off birds for Farmer Trotham. It keeps 'em out of mischief. Why do you turn away, Jude?" she continued. as the boy, feeling the impact of their glances like slaps upon his face, moved aside. The local washerwoman replied that it was perhaps a very good plan of Miss or Mrs. Follies, as they called her indifferently, to have him with her, to keep ye company in your loneliness, fetch water, shut the winder shutters o' nights, and help in the bit o' baking. Miss Fowley doubted it. Why didn't ye get the schoolmaster to take ye to Christminster wi' un, and make a scholar of ye? She continued in frowning pleasantry. I'm sure he couldn't ha' took a better one. The boy is crazy for books. That he is. It runs in our family, rather. His cousin Sue is just the same, so I've heard. But I have not seen the child for years, though she was born in this place, within these four walls, as it happened. My niece and her husband, after they were married, didn't get a house of their own for some year or more, and they only had one till, well, I won't go into that. Jude, my child, don't you ever marry. 'Tisn't for the Follies to take that step any more. She, their only one, was like a child of mine own, Belinda, till the split come. Ah, that a little maid should know such changes. Jude, finding the general attention again centering on himself, went out to the bakehouse, where he ate the cake provided for his breakfast. The end of his spare time had now arrived, and emerging from the garden by getting over the hedge at the back, he pursued a path northward, till he came to a wide and lonely depression in the general level of the upland, which was sown as a cornfield. This vast concave was the scene of his labours for Mrs. Troutham, the farmer, and he descended into the midst of it. The brown surface of the field went right up towards the sky all round, where it was lost by degrees in the mist that shut out the actual verge and accentuated the solitude. The only marks on the uniformity of the scene were a rick of last year's produce, standing in the midst of the arable, the rocks that rose at his approach, and the path athwart the fallow by which he had come, trodden now by he hardly knew whom, though once by many of his own dead family. How ugly it is here, he murmured. The fresh harrow lines seemed to stretch like the channelings in a piece of new corduroy, lending a meanly utilitarian air to the expanse, taking away its gradations, and depriving it of all history beyond that of a few recent months, though in every clod and stone there really lingered associations enough and to spare, echoes of songs from ancient harvest days, of spoken words and of sturdy deeds. Every inch of ground had been the site, first or last, of energy, gaiety, horseplay, bickerings, weariness. Groups of gleaners had squatted in the sun on every square yard. Love matches that had populated the adjoining hamlet had been made up there between reaping and carrying. Under the hedge, which divided the field from a distant plantation, girls had given themselves to lovers who would not turn their heads to look at them by the next harvest. And in that ancient cornfield many a man had made love promises to a woman at whose voice he had trembled by the next seed time after fulfilling them in the church adjoining. But this neither Jude nor the rooks around him considered. For them it was a lonely place, possessing, in the one view, only the quality of a work-ground, and in the other that of a granary, good to feed in. The boy stood under the rick before mentioned, and every few seconds used his clacker or rattle briskly. At each clack The rooks left off pecking, and rose and went away on their leisurely wings, burnished like tassets of mail, afterwards wheeling back and regarding him warily and descending to feed at a more respectful distance. He sounded the clacker till his arm ached, and at length his heart grew sympathetic with the birds' thwarted desires. They seemed like himself, to be living in a world which did not want them. Why should he frighten them away? They took upon them more and more the aspect of gentle friends and pensioners, the only friends he could claim as being in the least degree interested in him, for his aunt had often told him that she was not. He ceased his rattling, and they alighted anew. "Poor little dears," said Jude aloud. "You shall have some dinner, you shall. There is enough for us all. Farmer Troutham can afford to let you have some. Eat then, my dear little birdies, and make a good meal." They stayed and ate, inky spots on the nut-brown soil, and Jude enjoyed their appetite. A magic thread of fellow-feeling united his own life with theirs. Puny and sorry as those lives were, they much resembled his own. His clacker he had, by this time, thrown away from him, as being a mean and sordid instrument, offensive both to the birds and to himself as their friend. All at once he became conscious of a smart blow upon his buttocks, followed by a loud clack which announced to his surprised senses that the clacker had been the instrument of offence used. The birds and Jude started up simultaneously, and the dazed eyes of the latter beheld the farmer in person, the great Troutham himself, his red face glaring down upon Jude's cowering frame, the clacker swinging in his hand. "So it's eat, my dear birdies, is it, young man? Eat, dear birdies, indeed. I'll tickle your breeches and see you say, 'Eat, dear birdies,' again in a hurry. And you've been idling at the schoolmaster's, too, instead of coming here. Ha'n't ye, hey? That's how you earn your 6 pence a day for keeping the rocks off my corn." Whilst saluting Jude's ears with the impassioned rhetoric, Troutham had seized his left hand with his own left, and swinging his slim frame round him at arm's length, again struck Jude on the hind parts with the flat side of Jude's own rattle, till the field echoed with the blows, which were delivered once or twice at each revolution. "Don't he, sir? Please don't he?" cried the whirling child, as he helpless, under the centrifugal tendency of his person, as he hooked fish swinging to land, the beholding, the hill, the rick, the plantation, the path, and the rooks going round and round him in an amazing circular race. I, sir, only meant that there was a good crop in the ground. I saw 'em sow it, and the rooks could have a little bit for dinner, and you wouldn't miss it, sir. And Mr. Phillotson said I was to be kind to him. Oh!" This truthful explanation seemed to exasperate the farmer even more than if Jude had stoutly denied saying anything at all, and he still smacked the whirling urchin, the clacks of the instrument continuing to resound all across the field and as far as the ears of distant workers, who gathered thereupon that Jude was pursuing his business of clacking with great assiduity, and echoing from the brand-new church tower, just behind the mist, towards the building of which structure the farmer had largely subscribed to testify his love for God and man. Presently, Troutham grew tired of his punitive task, and depositing the quivering boy on his legs, took a 6 pence from his pocket and gave it him in payment for his day's work, telling him to go home and never let him see him in one of those fields again. Jude leaped out of arm's reach and walked along the trackway, weeping, not from the pain, though that was keen enough, not from the perception of the flaw in the terrestrial scheme, by which what was good for God's birds was bad for God's gardener, but with the awful sense that he had wholly disgraced himself before he had been a year in the parish, and hence might be a burden to his great aunt for life. With the shadow on his mind, he did not care to show himself in the village, and went homeward by a roundabout track behind a high hedge and across the pasture. Here he beheld scores of coupled earthworms, lying half their length on the surface of the damp ground, as they always did in such weather at the same time of year. It was impossible to advance in regular steps without crushing some of them at each tread. Though Farmer Troutham had just hurt him, he was a boy who could not himself bear to hurt anything. He had never brought home a nest of young birds without lying awake in misery half the night after, and often resonating them and the nest in their original place the next morning. He could scarcely bear to see trees cut down or lopped from a fancy that had hurt them, and a late pruning, when the sap was up and the tree bled profusely, had been a positive grief to him in his infancy. This weakness of character, as it may be called, suggested that he was the sort of man who was born to ache a good deal before the fall of the curtain upon his unnecessary life should signify that all was well with him again. He carefully picked his way on tiptoe among the earthworms without killing a single one. On entering the cottage, he found his aunt selling a penny loaf to a little girl, and when the customer was gone, she said, "Well, how do you come to be back here in the middle of the morning like this?" "I'm turned away." "What?" "Mr. Troutham have turned me away because I let the rooks have a few peckings of corn, and there's my wages, the last I shall ever ha." He threw the sixpence tragically on the table. "Ah," said his aunt, suspending her breath, and she opened upon him a lecture on how she would now have him all the spring upon her hands doing nothing. "If you can't scare birds, what can you do? There, don't you look so deedy. Farmer Troutham is not so much better than myself, come to that, but 'tis a job," said. "Now they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. His father was my father's journeyman, anyhow, and I must have been a fool to let 'ee go work for un, which I shouldn't ha' done, but to keep 'ee out of mischief." More angry with Jude for demeaning her by coming there than for dereliction of duty, she rated him primarily from that point of view, and only secondarily from a moral one. "Not that you should have let the birds eat what Farmer Troutham planted. Of course you was wrong in that, Jude. Jude, why didn't thou go off with the schoolmaster Tundine to Christminster or somewhere? But oh no, poor ornery child, there never was any sprawl on thy side of the family, and never will be. Where is this beautiful city, aunt? This place where Mr. Tillotson is gone to?" asked the boy, after meditating in silence. "Lord, you ought to know where the city of Christminster is. Near a score of miles from here. It is a place much too good for you ever to have much to do with, poor boy, I'm a-thinking." "And will Mr. Tillotson always be there?" "How can I tell? Couldn't I go to see him?" "Lord, no. You didn't grow up hereabout, or you wouldn't ask such as that. We have never had anything to do with folk in Christminster, nor folk in Christminster with we." Jude went out, and feeling more than ever his existence to be an undemanded one, he lay down upon his back on a heap of litter near the pigsty. The fog had by this time become more translucent, and the position of the sun could be seen through it. He pulled his straw hat over his face, and peered through the interstices of the plating at the white brightness, vaguely reflecting. Growing up brought responsibilities, he found. Events did not rhyme quite as he had thought. Nature's logic was too horrid for him to care for. That mercy towards one set of creatures was cruelty towards another sickened his sense of harmony. As you got older, and felt yourself to be at the center of your time, and not at a point in its circumference as you had felt when you were little, you were seized with a sort of shuddering, he perceived. All around you there seemed to be something glaring, garish, rattling, and the noises and glares hit upon the little cell called your life, and shook it, and scorched it. If he could only prevent himself growing up, he did not want to be a man. Then, like the natural boy, he forgot his despondency and sprang up. During the remainder of the morning he helped his aunt, and in the afternoon, when there was nothing more to be done, he went into the village. Here he asked a man whereabouts Christminster lay. "Christminster? Oh, well, out by there yonder, though. I've never been there. Not I. I've never had any business at such a place." The man pointed north, eastward, in the very direction where lay that field in which Jude had so disgraced himself. There was something unpleasant about the coincidence for the moment, but the fearsomeness of this fact rather increased his curiosity about the city. The farmer had said he was never to be seen in that field again, yet Christminster lay across it, and the path was a public one. So, stealing out of the hamlet, he descended into the same hollow, which had witnessed his punishment in the morning, never swerving an inch from the path, and climbing up the long and tedious ascent on the other side, till the track joined the highway by the little clump of trees. Here the ploughed land ended, and all before him was bleak, open down. Chapter 1, Part 3. Not a soul was visible on the hedgeless highway, or on either side of it, and the white road seemed to ascend and diminish till it joined the sky. At the very top it was crossed at right angles by a green ridgeway, the Icknield Street, and original Roman road through the district. This ancient tract ran east and west for many miles, and down almost to within living memory, had been used for driving flocks and herds to fairs and markets. But it was now neglected and overgrown. The boy had never before strayed so far north as this from the nestling hamlet in which he had been deposited by the carrier from a railway station southward, one dark evening from a few months earlier. Until now he had had no suspicion that such a wide, flat, low-lying country lay so near at hand, under the very verge of his upland world. The whole northern semicircle between east and west, to a distance of 40 or 50 miles, spread itself before him, a bluer, moister atmosphere, evidently, than that he breathed up here. Not far from the road stood a weather-beaten old barn of reddish-gray brick and tile. It was known as the Brown House by the people of the locality. He was about to pass it when he perceived a ladder against the eaves, and the reflection that the higher he got, the further he could see, led Jude to stand and regard it. On the slope of the roof, two men were repairing the tiling. He turned into the ridgeway and drew towards the barn. When he had wistfully watched the workmen for some time, he took courage and ascended the ladder till he stood beside them. "Well, my lad, and what may you want up here?" "I wanted to know where the city of Christminster is, if you please." "Christminster is out across there, by that clump. You can see it, at least. You can on a clear day." "Ah, no, you can't now." The other tiler, glad of any kind of diversion from the monotony of his labor, had also turned to look towards the quarter designated. "You can't often see it in weather like this," he said. "The time I've noticed it is when the sun is going down in a blaze of flame, and it looks like I don't know what." "The heavenly Jerusalem," suggested the serious urchin. "Aye, though I should never have thought of it myself, but I can't see no Christminster today." The boy strained his eyes also, yet neither could see the far-off city. He descended from the barn, and abandoning Christminster with the versatility of his age, he walked along the ridge track, looking for any natural objects of interest that might lie in the banks thereabout. When he repassed the barn to go back to Merry Green, he observed that the ladder was still in its place, but that the men had finished their day's work and gone away. It was waning towards evening. There was still a faint mist, but it had cleared a little, except in the damper tracts of subjacent country and along the river courses. He thought again of Christminster, and wished, since he had come 2 or 3 miles from his aunt's house on purpose, that he could have seen for once this attractive city of which he had been told. But even if he waited here, it was hardly likely that the air would clear before night. Yet he was loath to leave the spot, for the northern expanse became lost to view on retreating towards the village only a few hundred yards. He ascended the ladder to have one more look at the point the men had designated, and perched himself on the highest rung, overlying the tiles. He might not be able to come so far as this for many days. Perhaps, if he prayed, the wish to see Christminster might be forwarded. People said that, if you prayed, things sometimes came to you, even though they sometimes did not. He had read in a tract that a man who had begun to build a church, and had no money to finish it, knelt down and prayed, and the money came in by the next post. Another man tried the same experiment, and the money did not come, but he found afterwards that the breeches he knelt in were made of wicked Jew. This was not discouraging, and turning on the ladder, Jude knelt on the 3rd rung, where, resting against those above it, he prayed that the mist might rise. He then seated himself again and waited. In the course of 10 or 15 minutes, the thinning mist dissolved altogether from the eastern horizon, as it had already done elsewhere, and about a quarter of an hour before the time of sunset the westward clouds parted, the sun's position being partially uncovered, and the beams streaming out in visible lines between 2 bars of slaty cloud. The boy immediately looked back in the old direction. Some way within the limits of the stretch of landscape, points of light like the topaz gleamed. The air increased in transparency with the lapse of minutes, till the topaz points showed themselves to be the vanes, windows, wet roof slates, and other shining spots upon the spires, domes, freestone work, and varied outlines that were faintly revealed. It was Christminster, unquestionably, either directly seen or miraged in the peculiar atmosphere. The spectator gazed on and on till the windows and vanes lost their shine, going out almost suddenly like extinguished candles. The vague city became veiled in mist. Turning to the west, he saw that the sun had disappeared. The foreground of the scene had grown funerally dark, and inert objects put on the hues and shapes of chimeras. He anxiously descended the ladder and started homewards at a run, trying not to think of giants, Herne the hunter, Apollyon lying in wait for Christian, or of the captain with the bleeding hole in his forehead, and the corpses round him that remutinied every night on board the bewitched ship. He knew that he had grown out of belief in those horrors, yet he was glad when he saw the church tower and the lights in the cottage windows, even though this was not the home of his birth, and his great-aunt did not care much about him. Inside the roundabout, that old woman's shop window, with its 24 panes set in leadwork, the glass of some of them oxidized with age, so that you could hardly see the poor penny articles exhibited within, and forming part of a stock which a strong man could have carried, Jude had his outer being for some long tideless time, but his dreams were as gigantic as the surroundings were small. Through this solid barrier of cold, crustaceous upland to the northward, he was always beholding a gorgeous city, the fancied place he had likened to the New Jerusalem, though there was perhaps more of the painter's imagination and less of the diamond merchant's in his dreams thereof than in those of the apocalyptic writer. And the city acquired a tangibility, a permanence, a hold on his life, mainly from the one nucleus of fact that the man for whose knowledge and purposes he had so much reverence was actually living there, not only so, but living among the more thoughtful and mentally shining ones therein. In sad wet seasons, though he knew it must rain at Christminster too, he could hardly believe that it rained so drearily there. Whenever he could get away from the confines of the hamlet for an hour or two, which was not often, he would steal off to the brown house on the hill and strain his eyes persistently, sometimes to be rewarded by the sight of a dome or spire, at other times by a little smoke, which, in his estimate, had some of the mysticism of incense. Then the day came when it suddenly occurred to him that if he ascended to the point of view after dark, or possibly went a mile or two further, he would see the night lights of the city. It would be necessary to come back alone, but even that consideration did not deter him, for he could throw a little manliness into his mood, no doubt. The project was duly executed. It was not late when he arrived at the place of outlook, only just after dusk, but a black north-east sky, accompanied by a wind from the same quarter, made the occasion dark enough. He was rewarded. But what he saw was not the lamps in rows, as he had half expected. No individual light was visible, only a halo or glow fog overarching the place against the black heavens behind it, making the light and the city seem distant but a mile or so. He set himself to wander on the exact point in the glow where the schoolmaster might be, he who never communicated with anybody at Mary Green, now, who was as if dead to them here. In the glow he seemed to see Phillotson promenading at ease, like one of the forms in Nebuchadnezzar's furnace. He had heard that breezes traveled at the rate of 10 miles an hour, and the fact now came into his mind. He parted his lips as he faced the northeast, and drew in the wind as if it were a sweet liquor. "You," he said, addressing the breeze caressingly, "were in Christminster City between 1 and 2 hours ago, floating along the streets, pulling round the weathercocks, touching Mr. Phillinson's face, being breathed by him. And now you be here, breathed by me, you the very same." Again. "You," he said, addressing the breeze caressingly, "were in Christminster City between 1 and 2 hours ago, floating along the streets, pulling round the weathercocks, touching Mr. Phillinson's face, being breathed by him. And now you be here, breathed by me, you, the very same." Suddenly there came along this wind something towards him, a message from the place, from some soul residing there. It seemed surely it was the sound of bells, the voice of the city, faint and musical, calling to him, "We are happy here." He had become entirely lost to his bodily situation during this mental leap, and only got back to it by a rough recalling. A few yards below the brow of hill on which he paused, a team of horses made its appearance, having reached the place by dint of half an hour's serpentine progress, from the bottom of the immense declivity. They had a load of coals behind them, a fuel that could only be got into the upland by this particular route. They were accompanied by a carter, a second man, and a boy who now kicked a large stone behind one of the wheels, and allowed the panting animals to have a long rest, while those in charge took a flagon off the load and indulged in a drink round. They were elderly men, and had genial voices. Jude addressed them, inquiring if they had come from Christminster. "Heaven forbid! With this load?" said they. "The place, I mean, is that one yonder?" He was getting so romantically attached to Christminster that, like a young lover alluding to his mistress, he felt bashful at mentioning its name again. He pointed to the light in the sky, hardly perceptible to their older eyes. "Yes, there do seem a spot a bit brighter in the east than elsewhere, though. I shouldn't ha' noticed it myself, and no doubt it mid be Christminster." Here a little book of tales, which Jude had tucked up under his arm, having brought them to read on his way hither before it grew dark, slipped and fell into the road. The carter eyed him while he picked it up and straightened the leaves. "Ah, young man," he observed, "you have to get your head screwed on t'other way before you could read what they read there." "Why?" asked the boy. "Oh, they never look at anything that folks like we can understand," the carter continued, by way of passing the time. "On your foreign tongues used before the flood, when no two families spoke alike. They read that sort of thing as fast as a nighthawk will whir. 'Tis all learning there, nothing but learning, except religion. And that's learning too, for I never could understand it. Yes, 'tis a serious-minded place. Not but there's wenches on the streets o' nights. You know, I suppose, that they raise paisans there like radishes in a bed. And though it do take how many years, Bob? 5 years to turn a lurruping hobble-de-hoy chap into a solemn preaching man with no corrupt passions, they'll do it, if it can be done, and polish enough like the workmen they be, and turn out we a long face, and a long black coat and waistcoat, and a religious collar and hat, same as they used to wear in the Scriptures, so that his own mother would know un sometimes. There 'tis their business, like anybody else's. But how should you know? Now don't you interrupt, my boy. Never interrupt your seniors. Move and for hoss aside. Bobby's here. Saw me coming. You must mind that I be a talking of the college life. Lives on a lofty level. There's no gainsaying it, though I myself mid not think much of 'em. As we be here in our bodies on this high ground, so be thee in their minds. Noble-minded men enough, no doubt. Some on 'em able to earn hundreds by thinking out loud, and some of 'em be strong young fellows that can earn a'most as much in silver cups. As for music, there's beautiful music everywhere in Christminster. You med be religious, or you med not, but you can't help striking in your homely note with the rest. And there's a street in the place, the main street, that hadn't another like it in the world. I should think I did know a little about Christminster. By this time the horses had recovered breath and bent to their collars again. Jude, throwing a last adoring book at the distant halo, turned and walked beside his remarkably well-informed friend, who had no objection to tell him, as they moved on, more yet of the city, its towers and halls and churches. The wagon turned into a crossroad, whereupon Jude thanked the carter warmly for his information, and said he only wished he could talk half as well about Christminster as he. "Well, 'tis only what has come in my way," said the carter, unboastfully. "I've never been there, no more than you, but I've picked up the knowledge here and there, and you be welcome to it. A-getting about the world as I do, and mixing with all classes of society, one can't help hearing of things. A friend of mine, that used to claim the boots at the Crozier Hotel in Christminster, when he was in his prime, why, I knowed un as well as my own brother, in his later years." Jude continued to walk homeward, alone, pondering so deeply that he forgot to feel timid. He suddenly grew older. It had been the yearning of his heart to find something to anchor on, to cling to, for some place which he could call admirable. Should he find that place in this city, if he could get there? Would it be a spot in which, without fear of farmers or hindrance or ridicule, he could watch and wait and set himself to some mighty undertaking, like the men of old of whom he had heard? As the halo had been to his eyes when gazing at it a quarter of an hour earlier, so was the spot mentally to him as he pursued his dark way. "It is a city of light," he said to himself. "The tree of knowledge grows there," he added a few steps further on. "It is a place that teachers of men spring from and go to. It is what you may call a castle, manned by scholarship and religion." After this figure he was silent a long while, till he added, "It would just suit me." Chapter 1, Part 4. Walking somewhat slowly by reason of his concentration, the boy, an ancient man in some phases of thought, much younger than his years in others, was overtaken by a light-footed pedestrian whom, notwithstanding the gloom, he could perceive to be wearing an extraordinarily tall hat, a swallow-tailed coat, and a watch-chain that danced madly and threw around scintillations of skylight as its owner swung along upon a pair of thin legs and noiseless boots. Jude, beginning to feel lonely, endeavored to keep up with him. "Well, my man, I'm in a hurry, so you'll have to walk pretty fast if you keep alongside of me. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, I think. Physician Vilbert." "Ah, I'm known everywhere, I see. That comes of being a public benefactor. Wilbur was an itinerant quack doctor, well known to the rustic population and absolutely unknown to anybody else, as he indeed took care to be, to avoid inconvenient investigations. Cottagers formed his only patients, and his Wessex-wide repute was among them alone. His position was humbler, and his field more obscure, than those of the quacks with capital and an organized system of advertising. He was, in fact, a survival. The distances he traversed on foot were enormous, and extended nearly the whole length of the breadth of Wessex. Jude had one day seen him selling a pot of coloured lard to an old woman as a certain cure for a bald leg. The woman arranged to pay a guinea, in instalments of a shilling a fortnight, for the precious salve, which, according to the physician, could only be obtained from a particular animal which grazed on Mount Sinai, and was to be captured only at great risk to life and limb. Jude, though he already had his doubts about this gentleman's medicines, felt him to be unquestionably a travelled personage, and one who might be a trustworthy source of information on matters not strictly professional. "I suppose you've been to Christminster, physician?" "I have, many times," replied the long, thin man. "That's one of my centres." "It's a wonderful city for scholarship and religion?" "You'd say so, my boy, if you'd seen it. Why, the very sons of the old woman who do the washing of the college can talk in Latin. Not good Latin, that I admit, as a critic. Dog Latin, cat Latin, as we used to call it in my undergraduate days." "And Greek?" "Well, that's more for the men who are in training for bishops, that they may be able to read the New Testament in the original." "I want to learn Latin and Greek myself." "A lofty desire. You must get a grammar of each tongue. I mean to go to Christminster some day." "Whenever you do, you say that Physician Vilbert is the only proprietor of those celebrated pills that infallibly cure all disorders of the alimentary system, as well as asthma and shortness of breath. 2 and 3 a box, specially licensed by the government stamp." "Can you get me the grammars if I promise to say it hereabout?" "I'll sell you mine with pleasure, those I used as a student." "Oh, thank you, sir," said Jude, gratefully, but in gasps, for the amazing speed of the physician's walk kept him in a dog-trot which was giving him a stitch in the side. "I think you'd better drop behind, my young man. Now I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll get you the grammars and give you the first lesson, if you'll remember, at every house in the village, to recommend Physician Vilbert's golden ointment life drops and female pills." "Where will you be with the grammars?" "I shall be passing here this day fortnight at precisely this hour of 25 past 7. My movements are as truly timed as those of the planets in their courses." "Here I'll be to meet you," said Jude. "With orders for my medicines?" "Yes, physician." Jude then dropped behind, waited a few minutes to recover breath, and went home with a consciousness of having struck a blow for Christminster. Through the intervening fortnight he ran about and smiled outwardly at his inward thoughts, as if they were people meeting and nodding to him, smiled with that singularly beautiful irradiation which is seen to spread on young faces at the inception of some glorious idea, as if a supernatural lamp were held inside their transparent natures, giving rise to the flattering fancy that heaven lies about them then. He honestly performed his promise to the man of many cures, in whom he now sincerely believed, walking miles hither and thither among the surrounding hamlets as the physician's agent in advance. On the evening appointed he stood motionless on the plateau, at the place where he had parted from Vilbert, and there awaited his approach. The road physician was fairly up to time, but to the surprise of Jude, on striking into his pace, which the pedestrian did not diminish by a single unit of force, the latter seemed hardly to recognize his young companion, though with the lapse of the fortnight the evenings had grown light. Jude thought it might perhaps be owing to his wearing another hat that he saluted the physician with dignity. "Well, my boy," said the latter, abstractedly. "I've come," said Jude. "Who are you?" "Oh, yes, to be sure. Got any orders, lad?" "Yes." And Jude told him the names and addresses of the cottagers who were willing to test the virtues of the world-renowned pills and salve. The quack mentally registered these with great care. "And the Latin and Greek grammars?" Jude's voice trembled with anxiety. "What about them?" "You were to bring me yours, that you used before you took your degree." "Ah, yes, forgot all about it. Oh, so many lives depending on my attention, you see, my man, that I can't give so much thought as I would like to other things." Jude controlled himself sufficiently long to make sure of the truth, and he repeated, in a voice of dry misery, "You haven't brought them." "No, but you must get me some more orders from sick people, and I'll bring the grammars next time." Jude dropped behind. He was an unsophisticated boy, but the gift of sudden insight which is sometimes vouchsafed to children showed him all at once what shoddy humanity the quack was made of. There was to be no intellectual light from this source. The leaves dropped from his imaginary crown of laurel. He turned to a gate, leant against it, and cried bitterly. The disappointment was followed by an interval of blankness. He might perhaps have obtained grammars from Alfredston, but to do that required money, and a knowledge of what books to order. And though physically comfortable, he was in such absolute dependence as to be without a farthing of his own. At this date, Mr. Phillotson sent for his pianoforte, and it gave Jude a lead. Why should he not write to the schoolmaster and ask him to be so kind as to get him the grammars in Christminster? He might slip a letter inside the case of the instrument, and it would be sure to reach the desired eyes. Why not ask him to send any old second-hand copies which would have the charm of being mellowed by the university atmosphere? To tell his aunt of his intention would be to defeat it. It was necessary to act alone. After a further consideration of a few days, he did act, and on the day of the piano's departure, which happened to be his next birthday, clandestinely placed the letter inside the packing-case directed to his much-admired friend, being afraid to reveal the operation to his Aunt Drusilla, lest she would discover his motive and compel him to abandon his scheme. The piano was dispatched, and Jude waited days and weeks, calling every morning at the cottage post office, before his great-aunt was stirring. At last a packet did indeed arrive at the village, and he saw from the ends of it that it contained 2 thin books. He took it away into a lonely place and sat down on a felled elm to open it. Ever since his first ecstasy or vision of Christminster and its possibilities, Jude had meditated much and curiously on the probable sort of process that was involved in turning the expressions of the one language into those of another. He concluded that a grammar of the required tongue would contain primarily a rule, prescription, or clue of the nature of a secret cipher, which, once known, would enable him, by merely applying it, to change at will all words of his own speech into those of the foreign one. His childish idea was, in fact, a pushing to the extremity of mathematical precision what is everywhere known as Grimm's Law, an aggrandizement of rough rules to ideal completeness. Thus he assumed that the words of the required language were always to be found somewhere latent in the words of the given language by those who had the art to uncover them, such art being furnished by the books aforesaid. When therefore, having noted that the packet bore the postmark of Christminster, he cut the string, opened the volumes, and turned to the Latin grammar, which chanced to come uppermost. He could scarcely believe his eyes. The book was an old one, 30 years old, soiled, scribbled wantonly over with a strange name in every variety of enmity to the letterpress, and marked at random with dates 20 years earlier than his own day. But this was not the cause of Jude's amazement. He learnt for the first time that there was no law of transmutation, as in his innocence he had supposed. There was in some degree, but the grammarian did not recognize it, but that every word in both Latin and Greek was to be individually committed to memory at the cost of years of plodding. Jude flung down the books, lay backward along the broad trunk of the elm, and was an utterly miserable boy for the space of a quarter of an hour. As he had often done before, he pulled his hat over his face, and watched the sun peering insidiously at him through the intricacies of the straw. This was Latin and Greek. Then it was this grand illusion. The charm he had supposed in store for him was really a labor like that of Israel in Egypt. What brains they must have in Christminster and the great schools, he presently thought, to learn words one by one, up to tens of thousands. There were no brains in his head equal to this business, and as the little sun rays continued to stream in through his hat at him, he wished he had never seen a book, that he might never see another, that he had ever been born. Somebody might have come along that way who would have asked him his trouble, and might have cheered him by saying that his notions were further advanced than those of his grammarian. But nobody did come, because nobody does. And under the crushing recognition of his gigantic error, Jude continued to wish himself out of the world.